Hello, and welcome to the launch of Framework's Winter Appeal, Homeless to Home, Ending Homelessness by Tackling Rough Sleeping. My name's Andy Shields. I manage Framework's fundraising team. With me today is Claire Eden, our Head of Fundraising and Communications, and our Chief Executive, Andrew Redfern. We'll be hearing from Claire and Andrew very soon. Now, this year, Framework's Winter Appeal is all about our determination to end homelessness. During the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be hearing about our work preventing homelessness, supporting rough sleepers, and resettling people into safe and suitable accommodation. And before we leave, you're going to be hearing a little bit more about our appeal. But right now, let's go over to you, Claire, and Claire's going to be putting the questions to Andrew. Hello, Claire.
Hello, thank you very much, Andy, and welcome to our audience. So I'll start off by asking you, Andrew, can you tell us why Framework places such an emphasis on prevention?
I think we're all here and involved in Framework and supporting Framework because we agree that homelessness and rough sleeping are a bad thing. And with any bad thing, it's better to stop it from happening in the first place than deal with the consequences of it once it's happened. And so our priority is to prevent homelessness and especially to prevent rough sleeping. And that's why among the 18,000 or so people that Framework works with every year, the vast majority of those, 15,000, are people that we're working with in their homes or in the community in some way. So they're not people who are actually homeless, but they are people who are at risk. And if you can prevent it from happening, you prevent those bad consequences for the individual in terms of their health and their confidence and their outlook, but also for those around them and for society in terms of all of the costs of tackling homelessness. So for us, prevention is better, really is better than cure. Okay,
in that case then, why are there so many homeless people? If we place such an emphasis on prevention, why is it going wrong?
I think mainly because the commitment that as a society and a community we used to have towards prevention has gone. So if you look back to the Supporting People programme and 2009, 2010, right across the country, in all localities, there was some form of homelessness and crisis prevention service that people could be referred to very easily. And it was one of the first things that was decommissioned when austerity came. And in our areas, in Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, that was no exception. A lot of the preventative style services disappeared very quickly between 2010, 2012. We've been able to hold on to some of them, particularly in Nottingham City, but the vast majority of them have disappeared. And we've seen the consequences of that in terms of more people presenting as homeless, both to local authorities and to ourselves, and more people arriving on the streets. And I think over the last couple of years, that's really reached a peak.
Thanks, Andrew. Could you perhaps give the audience an update on the numbers of people that we're seeing sleeping rough, and perhaps any sort of trends that our street outreach team have observed, or yourself for that matter?
Well, in the 9 years to 2017, across the country as a whole, the official figures for rough sleeping increased from around about 1,700 to, I think it was about 5,400. So they pretty much tripled. And locally, we saw a very similar pattern. In fact, I think it was a bit worse locally. We'd got the numbers down to 3 on the official street count in 2010, and that was up as high as, I think it was about 45 by 2017. So a huge increase. That was in Nottingham. We saw similar patterns in Nottinghamshire and in Lincolnshire and in Derbyshire. Now, since then, the position has stabilised a little bit. We haven't seen those increases continuing, and in some areas we've been able to bring them down. So the latest official figure for Nottingham, I think, was the early 30s. So it went up a lot and then it stabilised. And then earlier this year, when the COVID pandemic began, there was a push to, a centrally driven push to get literally everyone in. Everyone in was what it was called. Yeah. And it was to reach out to people sleeping rough, regardless of their circumstances, including people with no recourse to public funds, who previously it was very, very difficult to help, and bring those people into emergency accommodation, which effectively meant hotels. And that happened pretty much over a weekend. Framework involving everyone in Nottinghamshire and Sheffield, Lincolnshire. And since then, there's been an effort to resettle those people who were brought indoors. And round about, I think altogether, there are about 160 people brought indoors in that way across all of the areas that we work. And around about 2/3 of those people have been successfully resettled since. But there are still people in the hotels, and tackling that is part of what we want to do over the next few months. In terms of what's happening on the streets, because we brought those people in and rough sleeping went down very sharply to almost zero for a while. But since then, we've seen a trickle of new people arriving on the streets. And so, you know, at one time, we're probably working with 50 or 60 people again across all the areas where we work of people on the streets. And they have arrived pretty much since March.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. What are the issues, systemic issues, if you like, that need to be addressed to, you know, prevent rough sleeping and to rehouse rough sleepers?
We've got this really weird system in this country where we kind of make differences in the status of people according to some pretty sort of outdated criteria. So we've got this category of people in priority housing need who are supposed to be those, you know, it includes people with families, which is reasonable, but among single homeless people, it's supposed to be those who are in the greatest need. But in fact, what we see is that the people who are sleeping rough tend to be those with the highest and the most complex needs, and the ones who find it the most difficult to get through the door of local authority housing and housing advice provision. So we've got these kind of categories of some people who are entitled to help and other people who aren't, and there's no real rationality to it anymore. It's not kind of, it's not up to date. And the best example of that, I think, is people who have come from perhaps other parts of Europe, or people who have been fleeing persecution, so they're asylum seekers, particularly if they're failed asylum seekers, so they've not been granted leave to remain or the right to work, and often they can be completely destitute. So we've got groups of people sleeping rough who, for one reason or another, can't get help, and actually in many ways are the most difficult people to resettle and to work with. So I think if we want to get rid of homelessness and rough sleeping, what we've got to do is get rid of those artificial categories and start to treat people as individuals and allow them to, you know, tell us their story so we can work out what it is they really need, what kind of housing, what kind of treatment, what kind of ongoing support, what their future prospects may be, and how we might be able to get them into paid employment, you know, whether they perhaps need to return to home, in inverted commas, whether that's somewhere here or somewhere in another country. All of those things, but we've got to kind of treat them as individuals. And I think that's the systemic problem, that people are treated as part of categories, and we respond or fail to respond to their needs according to that. And that, I think, is the big change of a kind of mentality, I think, that needs to happen.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really insightful. Can you perhaps tell the audience what plans that Framework has in the pipeline in terms of housing options for people who are rough sleeping?
Well, I think the important word there is options. Because it's not just that not everyone's the same. In fact, everyone is different. And some people, you know, need different things to others. So those with the highest and most complex needs are likely to need some form of continuing supported accommodation, often on an indefinite basis. So that may be something like a housing first provision, where we offer someone tenancy and we wrap, you know, the support that they need around that. It may be supported accommodation. Others, you know, are really, you know, are on a path to resettlement that they can sort of follow, you know, relatively independently, and we may be able to sort of place those in the private sector. Some people, for historic reasons, can't be rehoused in that way because of their histories, the private and indeed mainstream social landlords sometimes won't take them, and that's where we need to make suitable accommodation provision for them. So part of what we're trying to do is actually fill the gaps in provision by creating our own good quality move-on accommodation, and that's a big priority for us. So it's a combination of things. It's relationships with the private sector, assurance to those landlords that we can support people into resettlement and through the resettlement process, good quality supported accommodation, move on accommodation, and sometimes it'll be a reconnection plan. So I think options is the key thing, and what we're always trying to do is look at where the gaps in what's available and try and make suitable provision.
Fantastic. I'm sure, I don't know if the audience know a lot about Housing First, but it's my understanding that Framework has recently had an allocation to provide new units of Housing First support across the East Midlands. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, additional rather than new, I think would be the word I would use. Yes, we already have funding from central government, Ministry of Housing and Local Government, to provide revenue support for people in a Housing First setting, and that is 25 people. We're very hopeful that we're about to get an allocation of capital to develop more units over in Nottingham and in the areas around Nottingham, and some in Lincolnshire as well, from something called the Rough Sleepers Accommodation Programme. So it's important not to see Housing First as the one solution. It isn't that. It's part of a wider range of options that together I think can be a solution, alongside good prevention work as well. But yes, we are continually trying to expand our Housing First offer as part of our overall strategy.
And when it comes to resettlement, because we're at the final part of the journey, we're looking at prevention, we're looking at sort of supporting rough sleepers, and now at sort of our resettlement work. What does Framework do, to provide support for somebody in the long term to help them maintain and sustain their lifestyle going forward?
Well, again, it's important that the approach is personalised. It looks at the needs of each individual. And so we will focus support on whatever that individual needs. So it may, for instance, be an ongoing treatment package for a mental health issue or a substance issue. It may be some life skills training that will help that person to maintain their tenancy, or some employment related training that's going to get them ready to apply for jobs and go to interviews and be credible, and make an offer to an employer that they might accept. Or it could be a combination of those things. So, Framework sort of rests on these 4 pillars, which are housing, health, employment and support. And the reason for that is that each of the individuals that comes to us needs either one of those or some combination of one of those. And so we increasingly look to take parts of those offers and build a plan around each individual for a reasonable length of time. And sometimes that plan may be, it may be something that lasts a matter of weeks. It may be about finding a suitable tenancy and then they're off and running, or it may be something that needs to go on for years. And the key point is that, what we don't want to do is get people resettled and then, either not provide the right balance of support or the right kind of support, so they just become homeless again, and we're back to square one.
And how would you sort of sum up the benefits to the wider community of the work that we do?
Well, I think increasingly we've seen over recent years that the public has begun to find homelessness, and especially rough sleeping, unacceptable. I think back 20, 25 years when I lived in London, and we had a period of very high levels of rough sleeping in the 90s. And I think there wasn't a great deal of tolerance of that. I think there was a view at the time that, people had made bad choices and, they brought things on themselves and so forth. I really do think attitudes have changed. And this most recent time when rough sleeping went up, we found that there was a lot of public support for the work that we were doing, and some political pressure actually to tackle it. And so you've got, for the first time, I don't remember a government before having a target to end rough sleeping completely, as it says it wants to do by 2027. Now, there's another issue about, whether it's going about that in the right way and what needs to happen, but at least having the target is a good thing. So I think we have, a public that doesn't want this to be and doesn't think it should be in a civilized service and society. And I think that's a great start. And so it's not just what's visible and the fact that when you see people, perhaps when you see people begging or clearly in distress or clearly ill, that you have a sense that all is not as it should be. But I think it's also the way that then impacts on our public services. So, it impacts on our health service. It impacts on, you see it at accident emergency. Yeah. It impacts sadly on the criminal justice system and the prison system. There are many people, for instance, in prison who probably need not be there, and had we had the earlier intervention and the support, they wouldn't have been there. It impacts on the labour market because there are people with untapped potential, who are not in the labour market who should be there. So in all those kind of ways, the existence of homelessness doesn't just make us feel that all is not well, but it really actually means that all is not well, all is not as it should be. And I think, there's increasing recognition that society is better when it's integrated, when people are included, when, everyone has a role and an opportunity to contribute to it and to realise their aspirations. And so, the impacts are wide, and the benefits of tackling this similarly are enormous.
That's very inspiring. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Claire.
Just to bring us back to our current reality and the situation in which we find ourselves, we know that the last 6-7 months have been extremely challenging for everybody, but for Framework in terms of our service delivery and maintaining that, and financially. Can you perhaps talk a little bit about how Framework has been able to meet the financial challenges in particular?
Yes, well, initially we talked about everyone in, and the fact that there was a pretty much a directive from government to stop excluding all these people who were sleeping rough and finding reasons not to help them, and actually start to support them. And we responded to that really in the belief that we were going to get some resource that might help us to do that. Yeah. And remarkably, that resource never materialised. So we spent a lot of money on that, and also on the provision, the continuing provision of support to the people we're already working with. So at any one time, we're now housing about 1,500 people, and they are the most vulnerable people that we serve, almost by definition, because they're people who can't be housed by other landlords. And so it wasn't an option just to kind of walk away from that. We had to continue housing and supporting those people. So even though we had a large proportion of our staff, I mean, at one stage it was about 20% who were off due to kind of shielding instructions and so forth, we continued to deliver our services and all our other services as well. Yeah. So the support to people in the community, we modified the way in which it was being done, and our drug and alcohol treatment and our employment-based services. So pretty much we carried on, albeit in a modified form, and that meant we had to to invest in things like personal protective equipment to keep our staff safe. It meant that we were having to move people around from shift to shift, spend a lot more on things like overtime and cover staff. So there was extra expenditure, and also we set up a team which you were very much involved in, Claire, sort of heading up volunteers who helped us to do things like, drop off meals to people who were self-isolating or shielding, and to sort of, support people who were on their own. So all of that stuff, cost money, and we did incur additional expenditure. We have had some help with that from various sources, some fantastic people locally, people who have responded to our appeals, individuals, some local charitable trusts. But I think I particularly like to mention the Beat the Streets event, the festival event in February, which we managed to happen, or it's late January actually, happened just before COVID happened, and that's raised, I think it's about £300,000 getting on for it. It's raised altogether over a number of years, which is just fantastic. It's a huge thanks to DHP family and George for that. Nottingham Building Society, who've sponsored us, helped us over a number of years, have done some special things with us as well this year. A big donation of £30,000 and help in with our rent and a number of other things. So various sort of smaller charitable trusts. So people locally have helped a lot. We've also had a grant of £200,000 from the Big Lottery Fund. And the great thing about all of these things is that we've been able to use them for what we needed to use them for, rather than sort of contract income, which is, which has to be for, a particular purpose, which perhaps meets the objectives of the statutory agency. And that flexibility at a time like this has been absolutely crucial, because we really have had to think on our feet and be very nimble about the way that we've done things. So we've got through by huge effort, by a lot of support. Having said that, we still need more support, and that's what the Winter Appeal is about. Because, as I said earlier, if we're going to work with all the people that we want to work with, there really are gaps in the provision. So we've got these people brought into hotels, but we have to resettle them. Some of those people are people with no recourse to public funds, and it's very difficult to help them because we're not allowed to use the normal kind of systems to do that. And there are people who need not only a roof over their head, but also the right kind of support and treatment, which we're not necessarily funded to do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew. We've had a couple of questions from our audience as we've been talking. One very sort of current and up to date. We've been hearing about the infection rate in Nottingham, and we're in Nottinghamshire, and we're probably heading towards a partial lockdown, as we know. Somebody really wants to know that what are the immediate and medium-term implications for homeless people trying to access accommodation, and for us and others trying to provide it, given those circumstances being reimposed? Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about we've got some people who are still in hotels and emergency accommodation, and we're still trying to resettle them. We're still, obviously, as I said, finding people on the streets who are new to the streets. And the key to sort of making all of that work is having throughput from our services, so that when people are in our hostels or our supported accommodation and they are ready to move on, and they've got the wherewithal to live more independently, that we have somewhere for them to go. And the sources that are normally available are less available at times when there's either a lockdown going on or restrictions on what people can do. So for all sorts of reasons, so it's harder to get contractors into properties to do any repairs or redecorations that need to be done on reletting. It's harder to get the kind of sign-ups and all the, sometimes the bureaucratic steps that you need to go through in order to get someone into a tenancy, all the things that you need to do to change a benefit claim. So it's a really kind of mundane sort of day-to-day things, which can mean that the system, particularly the availability of move-on accommodation, can sort of grind to a bit of a halt. And what that then means is that you've got people stuck in hostels and supported accommodation when they no longer need to be there, and that then means that we don't have the spaces coming free to bring new people into. There's that danger really, that things just kind of clog up really. And we have to work, particularly at these times, and it's a really good question, because I think we are seeing in many of the areas where we work that things are getting worse again, and there are going to be more restrictions. So we have to to work especially hard to sort of keep keep things oiled and keep the system going, and keep things from kind of clogging up. And one of the ways that we can do that is to continue with our own programme of sort of developing move on accommodation, because part of what we're doing is trying to sort of create more capacity.
Yeah.
And that's why the hoped for government funding will be really helpful with that, but also why we need our winter appeal, mainly to actually support people into that accommodation.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, the question included about the medium term.
Yeah.
I'm still optimistic about the medium term, because I think what the pandemic has shown is that there are real dangers in leaving some people sort of isolated and excluded, and withholding support from them. There are dangers to their health. Rough sleeping is a very, very dangerous thing to be doing and to be engaged in. The life expectancy of a rough sleeper is decades shorter than that of people in the general population. And I think the risk of COVID or other infections actually kind of spreading in the rough sleeping population is very serious and has impacts on everyone else. And I think it's kind of illustrated that, and the need for people not just to have a room in a house, but enough space to be able to self-isolate if they need to, I think has been very well demonstrated. So I do sense on the part of decision makers a greater recognition, not just of the need for more accommodation for this client group, but also that needs to be of good quality. And offering them poor quality accommodation isn't a good solution. So in the medium term and the long term, I still hold some optimism, and I hope that doesn't prove to be unfounded.
That's a really upbeat note to finish on. So thank you very much, Andrew. I, for one, have really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully our audience have as well. If we haven't been able to answer any of your questions, we'll try to do that later, either sort of via email or again through this chat. So I will hand over to Andy Shields, who's just going to round off the webinar with a few asks.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you, Andrew. So Frameworks Winter Appeal is officially launched, and the appeal's going to run until the end of January, and we've got all sorts of exciting ways you can be involved. On the 1st of November, we're going to be launching our first ever online challenge event, so please do look out for that. We'll also be keeping in touch with you via email, so do please also follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and keep an eye out for those special announcements. Before we go, I want to say thank you for supporting Framework. Your support makes a big difference to us. It can be life-saving for the people that we help. So thank you for your time. Thank you for caring. Thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.